A year? Adakis thought to himself. Has it already been a year? A bitterly harsh winter, a glorious spring, a sweltering summertime, and a colorful autumn had all passed by since the day that Salvador fled from Callister. Now, winter was soon to be upon them again, and Adakis had not heard a single word from his brother. For weeks, Adakis had been unable to leave the castle, half out of guilt and also out of fear. But by the end of that winter, Adakis was convinced that Salvador would not be anywhere near the castle. For a while, he and Marcus had drifted apart, but by the autumn, Adakis was determined to recover their friendship. Marcus seemed as heavy-hearted as Adakis was, and he too was sick with guilt. But they did not feel what they had done was wrong in trying to help Salvador, and did not regret what they had done. But they missed him terribly, and blamed themselves for his reaction. Now alone, or possibly worse, Salvador was as helpless as a child, and as hunted as the exiles. Despite their protests, Salvador was regarded as an enemy of Callister, and would be charged with treason if he was ever caught. So for that, Adakis did not hope for his brother to return. Run, brother, run as far away as your new strength can carry you. Far from these castle walls is where you will find haven. Do not hate me for what I have done to you, nor will I hate you for what you have done to me, Adakis thought as he gazed into the mirror, skimming the edge of his fingers along the right corner of his mouth, where a white scar traced down his chin. The wound had healed many seasons ago, but the scar would always be there, a reminder of the choices he had made. Marcus had also been wounded in the struggle. His right hand had received a painful slice from Salvador's dagger, so for many weeks, Marcus was unable to carry his battle axe, since he had trained himself to carry it in his right hand. And even after the wound had healed, he still found carrying the heavy silver battle axe in his hand to be difficult. By the night that would mark 1 year since Salvador's disappearance, the two had only just begun meeting again. They had not traveled to Kennedac, nor had they sailed together, but Marcus had been sailing alone quite a bit. After the night of the storm, when his sailboat was destroyed, the finest draftsman in Ghent was commissioned to begin work on a ship for Marcus, and by the time he next saw Adakis, Marcus was sailing to the docks on the deck of a ship worthy of the goddess herself, sturdy and menacing, whose sails blanketed the sky from light, and whose bow sliced through the waves without rocking. The ship bore the name the Atlas. And from the moment he stepped onto that powerful vessel and looked out over the docks from the high deck above the water, he instantly forgot his sentiment toward his little sailboat. But his first journey out to sea did not come until some time after it was presented to him. It was not until the day of his crowning as the king of the island of Ghent. His 21st birthday celebration had passed during the winter before, and recently, in early autumn, Marcus had taken his father Altama's place on the throne as the new guardian over the islands and the Favian villages. But even after being declared the king, Marcus was more than happy to regain his friendship with Adakis, and did not hesitate to travel to Callister in the mornings as he had done before. But the ship, the Atlas, requires many hands to man, so a crew was assigned to his ship each morning at the break of dawn. So on that first day that the Atlas left the dock, and Marcus stood out on the tip of the bow with his hands folded behind his back, and his father's crown atop his dark-colored hair, that was the beginning of a new era for Marcus. When he and Adakis were not together, and he was not engaged in the affairs of the kingdom, Marcus would be aboard his grand ship on the open water. Adakis, however, had limited his range of interests to things within the castle grounds, whether it be studying the records kept by ancient scribes, enjoying the cool evenings within the guarded grounds, or passing the hours in the comfort of the sitting room beside the fireplace. But the day of his own crowning as the king of Callister was rapidly approaching, and he would soon take his dear parents' place as the ruler of Callister. The memory of his parents had always been painful to recall, but he was hopeful to make them proud as they gazed down from the heavens at their son as he was crowned the next king. There were still many weeks until the ceremony, but he found himself constantly dwelling on it nervously. But he was not nervous about the event, or even about becoming king. He was nervous about opening the gates of the castle. On the day of his crowning, the gates would be opened for the people of the villages to gather in the courtyard to greet their new ruler, and among any of them, Adakis feared, could be his vengeful brother. What better opportunity for revenge would Salvador have than to strike Adakis down from the balcony as he greeted his people? He feared his brother's wrath, and how vulnerable he would be to the crowd. But thoughts such as these vanished when Marcus began visiting again each morning. That familiar, confident voice restored Adakis' spirits. Even after a year, the two found that their bond had not been lost. Soon, their laughter and reminiscences replaced the fears that had clouded Adakis' mind, and by their fourth meeting, they found that neither one of them had made a journey to northern Ketadak since Salvador's disappearance. So in the highest of spirits, the two retraced their same old path, which they had known since they were children. Though feeling slightly inferior to Marcus now that he was a king, their boyish love of adventure outweighed their regality. Racing through the villages of Callister and across the grasslands between the kingdoms toward the shadow of Ketadak on the skyline, Adakis and Marcus seemed as close as brothers and were as mischievous as children. But those feelings vanished as they drew closer to Ketadak and spotted the cloud of black smoke rising into the sky above the villages. Pillars of fire and smoke coated the sky, but aside from the crackle of the flames, all was quiet as they approached the tragic scene. Piles of ash and charred logs were all that remained of most of the homes and businesses in Ketadak. The two gazed about them in dismay as they passed through the barren streets. "What has happened here?" they repeated to each other, neither one of them knowing how to answer the other. The only building which seemed to be intact was the castle in the heart of the ruins. There, as they drew nearer to its towering stone spires, they found men stationed outside with armor and spears. Shouting for the two men to halt, the guards asked what their business was. Adakis responded by asking what had happened to Ketadak and what had become of the people. The two listened in shock as one of the armored men responded with, "The kingdom of Ketadak is now under the rule of the Dark Lord." It was true. The two realized as they saw the man's face, which bore the seal of darkness, these men were exiles, servants of the Dark Lord Devane. Ketadak was now under the control of the fiend whom Adakis had heard only of in the documents recording the war against the Favians. But he had never seen the Dark Lord in person, only the exiles, the same sect which had murdered his parents when he was a child. For a moment, Adakis' eyes clouded, and he felt his hands begin to shake with rage. But Marcus rested his hand on Adakis' shoulder. "Control your temper, Adakis. We are helpless against these men right now." And Marcus was right. The men were heavily armored and armed with iron spears. And although Marcus seldom traveled anywhere without his battle axe, the two were outnumbered. It would be wiser to hold their tongue, Adakis consented. But knowing that the Dark Lord's men had overtaken Ketadak not only meant that their own kingdoms were also at risk, but that his dear friend Princess Rachel and her father, King Santiago, had either been killed or forced to flee from Ketadak. "Where are the king and the princess?" Adakis shouted, hearing a gruffness in his voice that startled him. Irritated by the young man's questions, the armored exile ordered them away. And when Adakis repeated his question with aggression, the exile drew back his spear, aimed it briefly at Adakis, and launched it forward at him. But before the spear could strike, a flash of light blazed between them, and the spear halted in the air. Like a beam of sunlight, shining through the mist of the morning dew, a haze of long golden hair and white robes flickered by the two young men, and a slender, pale arm caught the spear. The spear burst into flames, and fell into ashes at the figure's feet. Adakis gazed in awe, motionless, but Marcus fell to one knee with his head bowed to his chest and leaned on his battle axe. Confused and alarmed, Adakis also dropped to one knee, only then realizing who it was who had intervened. Standing before them in all of her heavenly glory was their goddess, emanating light and beauty. But as she turned her face toward them and her radiant eyes met theirs, tears welled in their eyes at the sight of her. Adakis had read the history of the goddess and knew that she was said to be beautiful, but it would be impossible to describe her that way, because beautiful would not be sufficient. The two choked to find words to thank her or to praise her, but the words were caught in their throat. Instead, they kept their head bowed to her and watched as her robe trailed along the ash-covered path toward the place where the man in armor stood aghast. They heard his armor scrape and some fell to the ground as he scrambled away from her, shouting and pleading for his life. The goddess did not pursue him, and instead turned back to her faithful ones, who still bowed before her. She asked them to look up at her in a voice that was like silk, and the two recognized her voice from the day she had called out to them in the sailboat to warn them about the tragedy of Adakis's parents. He lifted his head at the sound of her compassionate voice, but to gaze upon her was impossible. The light which glowed from her being and the beauty of her presence was far too much for a mortal heart to bear without clouding the eyes with tears of cherish. She explained softly that she had come to ask for their assistance. First, she pointed to Marcus, and she asked him to return to Ghent and wait there for her instruction, pointing toward the direction of the docks of Callister, and he nodded his head violently. With that he slipped away, stumbling through the blazing villages swiftly with his head still bowed. And then she pointed her hand to Adakis and asked for his help in reclaiming Kennedac from the enemy, Devane. She spoke as she approached Adakis slowly until she stood before him. "I will do anything you ask, Your Highness," he vowed, as he lifted his head a bit and saw her pale white arms folded in front of her lovely frame, which was shrouded in white robes. Raising his chin higher, he saw her long golden hair draped over her shoulders, veiling her magnificent head with smooth glimmering golden streams. And lifting his head until he stood up straight before her, he gazed humbly into her glittering sapphire eyes, which gleamed in contrast to her porcelain skin. He lowered his head quickly as the tears surfaced in his eyes. He smiled and felt a strange feeling of peace, as he had not known in many years, and he nodded his head. "Tell me your will, and it will be done." She smiled, although he could not see her, and warned that it would be a difficult task, and that it would require a great deal of faith. He nodded gently, knowing that the goddess would protect him against all harm, and that he would have nothing to fear. Turning her back to him, she led him out of the burning city. But their journey was a short one, leading to the shoreline not far from where the villages opened up into the meadows. The shore here was sandy and sharp with seashells. Few ever walked along this region of the shore, but this was where the goddess had led Adakis. The water was dim with the fade of sunlight in the evening, and the chilly autumn breeze gusted along the meadows beyond where they walked. As they stepped onto the shore, the seashells cracked beneath Adakis's feet, but the goddess's steps made no sound. The gentle rush of the waves upon the sand, the crackling of shells beneath his feet, and the soft wind were the only sounds he could hear as they walked. She turned her face to the sea, whose waves rippled toward them and crashed against the shore at their feet. Not looking back again, the goddess stepped into the water, and her robe swirled about with the pull of the tide. She walked up to her knees, and then beyond until the water was up to her waist. Adakis followed closely behind her. No man could withstand the cold for so long. Turning back and wading further into the water until her feet no longer touched the sandy ground, Adakis waded a bit further than she could before his feet could no longer touch the ground, and he lifted his chin as he treaded the icy water with his shaking arms. He hesitated again, gazing down into the dim water and spitting out another mouthful of salty seawater as the waves crashed over his head. Within a moment, he was beneath the waves, and the freezing water numbed his entire body. His head stung with the cold, and the water filled his ears, his nostrils, and the salt stung his eyes, despite clenching them shut. He lost the will over his body, and his hands went to his face to try to force away the water. But he had been swept out into the deeper water, and there would be no reaching the surface. He flailed underwater, and air bubbles rose around him as he sank deeper into the black depths.